Right, so we come now to our next subject, which is Ragwort. And again, I'll be sharing my screen with you. Here we are. So, more about Ragwort is our subject, and for once we have a plant rather than a bird. Somebody once said to me when Nature Observations was much smaller that I ought to change it to bird observations rather than nature observations. Admittedly, common scotus and chiffchaffs, the other two are birds this morning, but we do have Ragwort for a change and for any plant lovers who may be amongst us. Again, this subject was in this issue of Nature Observations, the October issue, and that was the article written by one of our volunteer staff writers, to whom we are very grateful for their contributions to the magazines. So Ragwort is the plant that we are going to be considering, and they're easily recognizable by those bright yellow flowers and the fact that they are quite commonly found all over the place on waste grounds and roadside verges and other such areas like those very common places, very obvious places. Now, I don't suppose any of the keen-eyed amongst you might be able to spot an insect in this plant, on this plant, I should say. Can you see an insect on that plant? It's just here, this sort of reddish thing. At least I'm pretty certain it's an insect of some sort, although I couldn't tell you which species of insect it is. But Ragwort is very important for all sorts of different creatures, as we shall see in a few moments. And this is another picture of Ragwort, perhaps a little more like what it will be at this time of year. If it is still around, there may be a few which look like this, which look most bedraggled. They look sort of brownish, and they've lost the glory of the yellow flowers. You know, when a flower dies over, then it becomes brownish, and then it turns sort of horrible looking. And then we have these little grayish balls of fluff, which are, of course, the seeds, which sort of adorn it for a little while to make it look reasonably respectable still. But it is not the same as when those bright yellow resplendent flowers are there evident to be seen. Now, we shall be considering, I suppose, more specifically for a good deal on nature that uses Ragwort. It is a most beneficial species of plant to all sorts of insects, especially. But at the same time, there is this conflict with the Ragwort that it is potentially a very dangerous plant. Now, we shall come on to that more specifically later, but one, we can't speak about the Ragwort without speaking about this particular moth. This is the cinnabar moth, which you may be familiar with. These lovely little moths, they're very colourful. For that reason, they're one of those moths that's a bit easier to identify and easier to see. Look at that now. It's got the sort of reddish colouring markings on the wings. In this light, the wings look a bit greyish, but if you look at them in some lights, they look really green and grey. It's quite a lovely colour. With that red, it just helps to bring it out really well. And of course, the cinnabar moth is mainly found in the south. So those of you who live further north may not have seen this moth very much, or may not see this moth very much. Obviously, they're mainly in the summer. You may have to wait till next year to see one. But they're generally grassland plants. Well, put it this way. They're found where Ragwort is found normally. If you have Ragwort, you're probably going to have cinnabar moths somewhere near you, because the connection between the two is so intrinsic that they're almost always found together. The name cinnabar is, of course, comes from the name of a mineral, which is that very same color, red, which is found on the wings of the cinnabar moth. It's a volcanic mineral, no less, which is found. cinnabar moths do also use groundsel and coltsfoot, which are two very similar species for their things, breeding on, feeding on as well. You may remember that there was an article in Nature Observations in June 2020, I think that is, I can't see the top of it, on the cinnabar moth. If you have that issue, you may like to go back and read that article again. Now this is groundsel, which is the other plant which cinnabar moths like to feed on. It's called groundsel. Very similar to ragwort. And also this is coltsfoot, which is very similar in structure, even though it looks rather different. Now, I suppose many of you will know what this is. This is the caterpillar of the cinnabar moth, which looks entirely different to the cinnabar moth. The cinnabar moth, you remember, was the red and greyish coloured creature. And this is yellow and black. You may say that both the adult form of the moth and the caterpillar, they're both very colourful. They're both remarkably colourful. And we can see that here. They're totally different from the adults. But these are the caterpillars, and they are easily recognizable. You can't mistake them. But there is also another creature which often uses ragwort, and is very heavily dependent on ragwort. It's a creature that's not really very well known. It's called the daisy carpenter bee. It's one of those sort of relations of the bee, I suppose you can put it. They're very small, they're very insignificant, and they're very difficult to identify as well. They're not likely to be able to see one of those because of their small size, difficulty to identify, and other things. There's not a lot known about them. If you research a daisy carpenter bee or look in books, you'll find very little about them. But they do use ragwort a lot, despite that, from what various people have been able to observe. Now we're going to look at some statistics which we have given concerning ragwort by those who have studied ragwort and looked at it. Now, obviously, with these statistics, we cannot say that they are precise. We cannot say that they are really anything more than a rough idea, because it's really impossible to follow an insect, to trace it. I'll see in a moment. The first thing is that 35 species of insects solely use ragwort for food. Now, these 35 insects quite possibly do use other species. As I say, it's impossible to track an insect. They have ways now of tracking birds, but tracking an insect is entirely different. Tracking all the members of an insect species to find out whether they do use another species of plant is almost impossible. But this is a figure that they have given. It is probably a general idea. And you see from 35 species of insects, one of which is almost certainly cinnabar moth, that it is a very important plant, because there are many, many creatures, small creatures, which rely on it for their survival. And also we move on to the fact that they include 7 moths and 7 beetles. That is in these 35. Now, if you want to do a little bit of maths, you can work out how many are left over once you've taken off 7 plus 7. If you take off 7 plus 7, then you're left with how many? I'll leave you to work that out. But 7 moths and 7 beetles, of course, the cinnabar moth is one of the moths. And there are a handful of beetles that can be found as well. Of course, 21 is the correct answer for the number of species of insects left after you've taken off the 7 moths and 7 beetles. The next piece of information is that 83 further species use ragwort heavily for food. Now these are a separate 83. So we're not talking about the 35 anymore. We're talking about another set of insects. There's none of those 83 which are also amongst those 35. This is another lot entirely. And this may be a more reliable figure. It is more sensible to say that 83 further species use ragwort heavily, because that's more measurable. You can work that out, that you often see these species using ragwort for food. Whereas saying that they solely use ragwort is more debatable, I would say. We cannot tell the true extent of how much, though, they use these plants. And then, of course, you may know that there are parasites in the insect world. Now, the cuckoo is one of those birds which is a parasite. It is a parasitic bird. That is because, as you probably know, the cuckoo will lay its eggs in other birds' nests and use them, the host bird, to raise the young rather than raising them themselves. Now, of course, these parasite insects, they benefit from the insects. Some of them do the most gruesome things, which I won't go into detail on those. These 50 parasites also, it's a rough figure, they benefit from the fact that there are huge numbers of insects using ragwort. They will benefit from it greatly because they can use those insects to do what they have been made to do. And yet it is a sign of the fall that we have these creatures who will be so vicious and so horrible to other creatures. Now, the final point is, I think, the most debatable of the lot. Ragwort being reckoned the 7th best plant for nectar. How do you work that out? I don't know, but it's basically very good at producing nectar for insects, and subsequently, that is thought why they are used by insects so much that insects love this plant and will use it for food an awful lot. Now, as I did mention, there is a problem with ragwort. There's not all nice sides to this plant, because ragwort is considered to be highly toxic. Various creatures have been thought to have died from ragwort, from consuming it. And amongst those, they include deer, which are thought, although there seems to have been little study on that point, because not many people keep deer like they do sheep and cattle and horses. But some people even think, I think there is a sheep. Yes, there is a sheep. Some people even think that that is one cause of the cinnabar moth's decline, the fact that the cinnabar moth is poisoned by the ragwort. I think that may be taken to be fairly untrue, since cinnabar moths would not exist. It's probably fair to say if there was no thing called ragwort. If the ragwort poisoned them, then they would have all died off a very long time ago. That really appears not to have been a sensible suggestion. But it must be said that ragwort appears to cause problems not because the horses and the cattle and the sheep will eat it naturally. They don't. They won't naturally eat ragwort because they just have an inbuilt system that it's not good to eat. There's some things which creatures will avoid. They just will not eat it. And this is one of them. Cattle and horses and sheep will avoid ragwort and they won't eat it. The only time they will eat it is if there is nothing else for them to eat. If they're driven to desperation, then they will eat ragwort. But that is the owner's problem, not the ragwort's problem. And also, it may be considered that the other problem is when the ragwort get mixed in with the hay, it doesn't lose the toxic substance in it after it's died, after it's been dried out, and after it's been mingled with hay. It still remains toxic. Thus, consumption of ragwort, a large amount of ragwort, alongside eating the hay, is most likely the cause of death in the horses which have been killed. Although there are those who will argue still that the toxins found in the ragwort cannot be proven to come directly from the ragwort, because there are other species which have that same toxin which may have caused that same effect. So ragwort is very good, but it can be very bad if it gets in with hay. I think that is what we may say safely here. Generally, it is devoured by these things. They usually devastate the plant because nothing else can eat it. If nothing else eats it, then it would go rampant. But these caterpillars, if you've seen ragwort before and after cinnabar moth caterpillars have been on it, it is an amazing change that they make. They just strip it of all the leaves. They strip it of everything down to the basic sort of stem. Sometimes even that gets eaten. And then you're just left with a skeleton of a ragwort plant. That way, the ragwort is kept in check because of these caterpillars, which so often will just devour it and leave it to be nothing in a short time. So that's ragwort, and we shall come on to the common scoter, which is perhaps a bird that's maybe a little more unfamiliar to many of you. Again, give it about 10 minutes, and I will be back for that. So see you in a little while.